Hey everybody, P.A. Turner, executive producer and host of The Break It Down Show, your favorite show for, I don't know what, episodes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 times a week. My goodness, we've been busy. Hey, we just had our biggest month in October, and I wanted to thank all of you for listening. And the other thing I wanted to say is, we really appreciate you guys. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for sharing the show. Continue to do that. That really helps out. All right, a couple things real quick. Our guests today are Jennifer Keohane and Kelly Jakes. They are PhDs, and they wrote about female engagement teams. If that sounds familiar, it's because Dr. Rickards, Ledet, and myself have also written on these things. Now, those three doctors and I all got together, in part because Rich called me one day and said, hey, these ladies cited our work in their paper, and they've talked about female engagement teams. So, of course, we always want to lift up their work, our work, everybody's work, and try to help us all understand modern conflict more. So we're about to have a pretty heady conversation on the role of gender and how we look at, just in general, like what success looks like for female engagement teams. And then we add in that ground truth complexity. So you're going to hear a conversation that's going to be really like academic. And I hope you guys can appreciate how interesting it is for all of us as we try to solve these issues. If anything else, this really illustrates how complex and how challenging combat is in the modern time, because we have all of these competing things that sort of exasperate or antagonize each other. And these are our own goals, let alone what happens out in the village or, in the combat zone. So anyhow, I think you guys will appreciate the complexity of this conversation, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. And if nothing else, we're building literature towards a bigger and greater understanding of combat. If we need to have more of these conversations, for sure, Kelly and Jennifer are glad to come back on. All right, one more thing real quick. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. This is the giving season. This is when people give the most. So if someone says, hey, who do I give to? Let me just say Save the Brave. Just say, go to savethebrave.org and give there. These guys are solid. You know what we do. We know the hard work we do, how often we're always out trying to help and create benefits for those that are, struggling with PTSD, and we're trying to prevent these suicides. So that will be my ask is, as people are thinking about where to give money, have Save the Brave be on the tip of your tongue. All right, one more thing to say to you, super easy. You know what I'm going to say. Here comes Jennifer Keohane and Kelly Jakes.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland. This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Kelly Jakes.
I'm Jennifer Keohane, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
So anytime we get to have Dr. Rich on the show, even though he's just off screen right now, it's always fun. Anytime we get to talk about Afghanistan, and ladies, check this out. I plucked this off my tree this morning.
Wow.
I probably should have held off, but this is like the fruit of at least the valley that we were in, the fruit of the valley that we were in. And you guys have created your own fruit. You've done an academic paper talking about the female engagement teams. And as you know, Rich and I are some of the people that have been published on this very hardly anybody talks about academically topic. And so I thought it'd be wonderful for us all to get together. And one more thing, I've got a BA in mass comm, so I'm in the communications realm, nowhere near your guys' thing, but communications throughout my entire career as a spy and everything else.
Wow.
Communications has always been, we all know that stupid diagram of the noise and all the other stuff. That absolutely was a foundational thing for me to understand. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited to talk to people who study communications in any form at any level here on the Break It Down show. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're excited to be here.
Indeed.
Well, as soon as Google Scholar told me that someone cited our work, I had to check that out.
We were curious how you found our paper.
Thanks, Google. I wasn't looking for it,
Yeah. Jenny, you want to start?
Sure. So Kelly and I are both scholars of rhetoric. So broadly speaking, we study how what we would call rhetors or speakers or persuaders in a broad sense use symbols to accomplish goals. And so typically we tend to think of rhetoricians as studying kind of the old dead white guy, great speakers, Abraham Lincoln, all of that stuff. But it's certainly a much broader field now. And Kellyanne and I both did our doctoral work studying gender and war from a rhetorical perspective. I looked at the way that activists affiliated with the Communist Party were creating kind of a home for feminism during the early Cold War, which required me to study a little bit about, well, what were the messages that women and men were getting about appropriate masculinity and femininity during this time of war, very different kind of war. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about what you were studying?
Sure. Yeah, I was looking at France in the context of the Second World War, and I was looking at how French citizens were using resources provided to them by the genre of popular music, actually, in order to contest the new norms of nationhood that the Nazis were imposing on them, and then the Americans were imposing at the liberation as well. So I was also encountering a lot of gendered power systems in terms of who Nazi Germany was establishing as the appropriate French man and who was the appropriate French woman, and then how the Americans were also challenging those norms when they came in and liberated France, and then how the French themselves were trying to use popular music to take back control over what ideal gender looked like in their nation.
But so all of that is to say, when we decided we wanted to do a project together, we knew we were going to look in some context at how gender tends to get operationalized during war. Mm-hmm. I don't think in a million years we ever really anticipated the project turning out the way that it did.
No, for sure.
But there has been some great scholarship published in our field about how the war in Afghanistan was understood kind of from the beginning as a very gendered conflict, right? And so many of the messages that were circulating in 2003, 2004 were about liberating Afghan women from the brutality of the Taliban. So very much kind of a gendered frame from the beginning. But then you add the question of female engagement in there, and we have a whole nother level to understand how is it that women who are affiliated with the military are being sent out to do different types of work during this conflict as well. Ooh.
There we are. Love it. Yeah. So yeah, I think really just the case of the war in Afghanistan, it just really put gender front and center, as two people who are interested in studying war and gender in a more historical context. This allowed us the opportunity to do something a bit more contemporary and to examine gender even more explicitly than maybe we had in the past.
So were either of you on a FET or know anyone on a FET? Okay.
No.
That's.
Well, we did meet somebody actually in the course of this research who was a former FET.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did one interview with a woman who had served on a FET, mm-hmm. although she talked about it very much in its infancy, like 2010, before they started kind of the training camps that Gail Lemon writes about in Ashley's War. Mm-hmm. And she talks about it very much as kind of an ad hoc thing that was, they were flying by the seat of their pants, responding to pressures from above and pressures from below and that kind of thing. But no, neither Kelly nor I were FETs.
No.
Pete, would you agree that it was kind of an ad hoc thing? And they were just...
I'm going to quote a sergeant major. Well, why don't we get Sergeant Jakes to go out there? She's a female.
Yeah. Both of us having worked with FETs, and we've heard that time and again. So I think we're all in agreement there. And I think the body of literature that's come out, I think probably in the last 10 years on this topic, which is not a lot, but that body of literature points to that same finding. That's a common theme. Mm-hmm. So tell us, if you can, just, not just for the audience, but also for me, because I'm a political scientist and I've read this at least 3 times and I think I know what you're saying, but I heard you two talk about these really cool dissertations you worked on. I looked at religion. No, yeah. We heard that at a conference, Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, well, the paper that you guys you cited when we presented at the Command General Staff College. That paper was eventually published in the Journal of Military Ethics. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we had very well attended. Actually, I never had that many people at a conference attend my conference presentation. But yeah, there were people. The one person told us, I don't know why. Yeah. I don't know why, and I can't get the words exact. I don't know why I'm offended, but I'm offended. You know,
Really?
There's got to be a reason why I'm offended. Oh yeah, we angered people. Simply the title alone angered people.
Why were they so offended?
Why don't you?
Yeah.
At first, we had the word empowerment in there, and so we got yelled at for all women are empowered. We're like, we agree.
Wow.
Like, we're not disagreeing.
Yeah.
They always wanted to know which women we were talking about. Which women are you talking about? Theirs or ours? And so we had all these hurdles to overcome before someone had even read the abstract. And then you have the military structure that's like, you know, in disagreement in a variety of ways. And then personally, people who are on FETs or CSTs were offended in some ways because, and one thing we've learned across the board, and I've got a lot of time in combat zones and a lot of time with Rich trying to figure this stuff out, is we all believe we won the war when we were there. But when we look as a whole, we didn't. And so we have to go with the bigger picture of we probably all are wrong with our level of impact. But when you tell that to someone who's poured their heart and soul into something, it's impossible.
Yeah. It's deeply offensive. Yeah, they take it very personally, I'm sure. Yeah.
And one thing,
so everybody took offense. And so it was great because we got to have this conversation. And then as they heard about the paper, it was a lot less offensive.
And after we gave the presentation, it was really cool to listen to the audience members. Most of them were in uniform. And it was really interesting to listen to them fight amongst themselves as we were still standing on stage laughing. So.
Wow. And were they fighting about your major argument that?
In part, but they were also like, well, we did this. Well, we did it this way. Well, no, we think it should be done that way. But we had, well, it was females and male commanders in the room too. And they were, well, arguing amongst themselves. But, you know, we had people who were actively engaged in the process of trying to make FET better at the time. So, and even as a long-term concept and something that we will use again next time we're engaged in combat. Well, we're always engaged in conflict somewhere, you know. But let me back up because we jumped ahead of ourselves. Tell us what's going on here.
Well, so
and help me, like, pry into my political science brain and tell me what you guys are up to.
Well, I will say, like, one thing that you were talking about with all of the different people in the audience for your presentation and, you know, wanting to know which women you're talking about, that kind of resonates with the things that are happening in our paper, because I think actually there are a lot of different groups of women that we're talking about in our paper. And that includes the women who served on FETs. That includes the women policy analysts that are writing the reports that we analyze. And frankly, given how important, you know, engaging Afghan women was for the counterinsurgency, that includes kind of the way we talk about and represent Afghan women as well. So we have these sort of three groups that are kind of circulating through here. Do you want to start with a summary of the overall paper, Kelly? Or?
Yes, I think like if you just, you know, sort of boil down into layman's terms, what we're interested in is why, well, let me back up. We're interested in the consequences of these effectiveness reports that these two women write, Anna Cole and Sippy, and I can never pronounce her last name. Do you guys know how to pronounce her last name?
It's Azerbaijani?
Yes. Azerbaijani Moghadam, maybe?
Yep.
That's what we say.
That's a pretty good...
We found these two reports, read them, and then realized how frequently they were circulating in virtually all of the discourse about the FETs. And really how the way that I think we got the most interested in these reports was noting that a lot of the criticisms that they level against the FETs and lay solely at the FETs' feet are actually criticisms of counterinsurgency writ large that were circulating in the dominant press. So we started to wonder, you know, what's going on here in this representation of the FETs? It seems significant because it's being repeated in virtually everything that's being written about the FETs. You know, and so how can we understand this from, like, what is driving these analysts to represent them in this way, especially given what we know about the emergence of new gendered paradigms in the context of the war. So we certainly take issue with some of the ways that they represent the FETs. And, you know, I stand by those. I think that in many ways, the representations of the FETs is problematic and guilty of sort of perpetuating probably unconsciously, but nonetheless perpetuating some sexist paradigms and sexist ways of knowing. But yeah, that's, really the nuts and bolts of it is how are these women represented and what is the rhetorical consequence of it? So we're not, unlike you guys who have some real experience on the ground and are coming from, especially you, Rich, the discipline of political science, who's, more interested in answering the question of, was this useful? Was it efficacious? If not, how do we make it better in the future? Jenny and I are not really qualified to answer that question. What we're trying to do is answer the question of what was the discursive context in which these analysts were writing, and how did it influence the decisions that they made in terms of judging the FETs, and then why is that significant?
So just as a host note, when you say efficacious, I think I have one of those trees in my backyard, and discursive is how I write scripts, because it's not cursive, it's discursive. So, and listen, use the academic terms all you want. The audience can take it, I promise. But what the hell does discursive mean?
So by discursive, we just mean symbol systems. So in this case, we're looking at language, right? Okay. So how is what language choices are Sippy, Azerbaijani, Moghadam, and Anakul using to talk about the FETs, and why does that matter? What standards of evidence do they commit the FETs to for measuring their effectiveness, and why does that matter? And where are they getting those standards of measurement? What are the standards that the military is sort of imposing on these two authors in order for them to be able to demonstrate their expertise and authority?
And so we can think a little bit, I guess, about the discourse as a term operating in and circulating through texts. Mm-hmm. And so the primary texts that Kelly and I are analyzing in our paper are those two effectiveness reports. But we can also see the influence of, for instance, the Counterinsurgency Field Manual and the Commander's Guide to Female Engagement Teams and a bunch of other policy documents circulated by the military as kind of this foundation for a new kind of way of doing gender that counterinsurgency demands that previous ways of doing war would not have necessarily privileged or prioritized.
You enjoyed reading those field manuals, didn't you?
Oh gosh.
It's like learning a new language. It was like learning a new language.
But you guys have this framework of analysis, though. It's just you're able to apply it to FET and what happened in FET. You could maybe not easily, but this way to analyze discourse and the way discourse is used in an existing system, you can apply this template of analysis to females on police force, for example, or women in the classroom, even. Right? Is it safe to say that?
Yeah, it is definitely safe to say that. There's and there's been a lot of other research in the field of rhetoric that looks at, similar ways of understanding gender and war, and have taken other texts for analysis. Dana Cloud's a prominent professor in our field, and she has done an analysis of images from Time magazine coming out of the war in Afghanistan and how they were representing Afghan women as particularly in need of liberation and saving and that kind of thing. But so, yeah, I mean, this is sort of an orientation to asking questions about the world and how language works in the world that you can apply to all sorts of texts.
Yeah, for sure.
Because when I first came across the article, I was thinking that you guys were mad at us, but I don't think so. And I will, because we have one of our co-authors who actually is a female, my life partner, and she wants to know if she fell into the same trap. And I would like to tell her yes or no. Did we fall into the same trap that these two analysts set for everyone else? Because when I'm reading this, and like I said, I've read it at least 3 times, and last night was the last one, and I like it a little bit more because I don't think you're mad at us.
No. No, we're not mad at anybody. And I think also, we don't hold you responsible for seeing the things that we're pointing out because, you're interested in another set of questions. and you're not a rhetorician, right? So the questions that we're asking in this piece are not questions that you in poli-science would ask. So, but the hope maybe is that after you've read this piece, that your next, the next publication you work on this topic, you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't maybe I should interrogate or problematize some of these assumptions that Cole and Azarbajani are making, and break free of any sort of judgments that I've allowed them to cast over my own research,
Yeah. And to be clear, Kelly and I are not accusing Anna Cole and Sippy Azarbajani Moghadam of being like blatant sexist.
No.
We want to kind of unpack some of the assumptions that lay in their writing. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly also not the case that Kelly and I are arguing that we shouldn't do policy analysis or that we shouldn't try to understand whether the things we're telling our folks serving in uniform to do are actually working or not. We just want to try to problematize or cast a little bit of a deeper glance at some of the assumptions that are embedded within the arguments that we're making. Mm-hmm. And so we point to, in the last section of the essay, we point to kind of this social scientific knowledge paradigm that sort of automatically dismisses anything that's gathered or said in kind of an everyday interaction, because that's just gossip or that's just hearsay or that's just anecdotes. And while certainly we would want our military to be making decisions based on big bodies of evidence, to automatically dismiss that as not useful or not knowledge, we think is problematic.
Especially when you're dealing with a population that is significantly repressed. I mean, a lot of the literature on resistance emphasizes the importance of chit-chat and gossip and small ways of pushing back against authoritative regimes that can fly under the radar. So I think, that's, as somebody, I mean, my research has really been largely on resistance so far. So anytime I see somebody dismissing anecdotal evidence or gossip can be incredibly powerful in a community. When that gets dismissed, I automatically, get a little concerned. But sure, to Jenny's point, I mean, we as people who want to live in a safe and just world, we also want to figure out how it's possible to make our military expeditions more useful and work better and, meet the desired outcome for sure.
And I think this gets a little bit to the last point, or maybe it's not the last point, but one of the points that you all raise in your article about kind of understanding Afghan women and looking at them from a Western lens and some of the limitations in that representation too. And so I think, again, by dismissing the gossip and that kind of thing, we're falling into the expectations that Afghan women would act the way that Western women act, or that they would want the same thing and that kind of thing.
See, Pete, I told you we were playing similar sheets of music. Yeah, that's actually the third ethical pitfall that we bring up. But in our work, we're not interested in the efficacy of FETs, actually. And if to members of the audience out there, our paper, we make the argument we probably shouldn't have been doing this in the first place, in part because, as many analysts have said, we were not prepared. And I think you can even get that from some people who are members of FET.
Yeah, and they were asked, in my understanding, to sacrifice a lot of their own career opportunities to join FET, to give up opportunities for promotion to go do this. And it wasn't entirely, or at least it wasn't uniformly valued, the work that they were doing. So
to be fair, though, on the gender side of that, everybody in the military does that. If you get an assignment, you go do the assignment. So it's not as strong gender-wise. And the other thing I wanted to say too, and you guys would never be able to know this, but the military, State Department, they have a problem with this sort of lockstep form of communication, where we're required specifically to talk in a certain. You guys know this. There is a format for talking. And so assumptions are dragged along as fact, even when you're like, but this isn't reality. So there are things called baseball cards, and we're trying to keep track of everybody in the region. You've got this little baseball card, and you're reading. It's like, oh, okay, this person's evil Taliban mastermind, and you're like, but I've known this guy for 6 months now, and he doesn't have a fucking phone out here. What is he masterminding? And so reality and the baseball card disagree, and so this, and I'm using one example. There are the communication vertically is horrible. And so we lock people into this paradigm, whether they're female or male, whether it's us or them, and it becomes really hard to sort out what reality is. And if you talk outside of that reality, it's very easy to be shut out. The thing that I did the most when I was there as a communicator was I had to stay relevant and study us way more than I ever had to study them, because I could bring reality to them and they'd spit it out, kick me off the camp. And believe me, Rich and I have been kicked off camp.
Oh my gosh.
So it's that hard to communicate internally, So I don't know how that frames what you guys see things, but the challenges of getting these things right in terms of what it is, I think it goes. I don't think the gender thing is inappropriate at all, but it goes so far beyond that. Institutionally, theoretically, we have these hobbling moments, and that's why Rich and I basically say, like, it's probably unethical for us to do this because we want to change the condition of something without understanding what condition it's in, and we frankly don't care. And then you get into the do no harm zone, and you're like, how can we can't guarantee we're not going to do harm here. So, and not that it's not vitally important, though.
Well, and we put a lot of people in harm's way, and I think there was a lot more loss of life that didn't have to necessarily happen because we took this approach. Our approach is, and the reason why we use Azerbaijani Mughadam's work is because at the time that was really the only thing we could find that was on the ground.
Oh, absolutely! It's by far the most comprehensive study. Yeah.
You pick up on this because, and I think we're talking about this a little earlier. Some of these assumptions that go into, our rhetoric and our conversation, some of these assumptions that go into our planning processes turn into the same assumption or some of the same assumptions that we use to evaluate ourselves and our work. You shouldn't be allowed to audit yourself and then tell everybody how good you are.
Right.
So, and that's something that, Pete and I have seen in the field time and time again, but at the time, and I think that's and that's clearing up something for me right there, because Sippy is her name. That was the only thing we could find, because where Pete and I's work is right now. And oh, by the way, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm trained as an American comparativist who studies religion and politics in the United States. I don't do that anymore, right? That's just not even interesting for me, But what Pete and I are trying to bring to the academic world right now is like, let's look at the theory and let's look at the reality and explain the gap. Because Pete and I, time and time again, would report on something, as we see it, it may not make it to the briefing. That briefing keeps going up the chain. And then all of a sudden there are things that are being planned that don't reflect the reality on the ground. So Sippy's work really was the only thing we could find on the ground, because that's like, we start off with, David Kilcullen's work on counterinsurgency. And, I'm really glad that you guys talked about this. Like let's critique FET according to the broader critique of counterinsurgency. That would be a much more fruitful conversation to have. That's the conversation Pete and I were trying to have at the Command General Staff College when we pissed a bunch of people off.
You would have loved the first draft of this paper. We had a whole section that did that, and then we had to cut it because reviewer A didn't like it.
Well, tell reviewer A to shove it. Cut and paste that, and let's start another document and write a paper then,
Yeah, but I mean, I think your point is really well taken, and we're looking at similar things, and I certainly appreciate kind of the difference between the theoretical structures and the on the ground. And it seemed, in talking to, and we were only able to interview one FET, and then our research kind of took us in a different direction. But she was pointing out just how incredibly dependent it was on having a commanding officer that had some sense of what value these women could bring, and were willing to send them out. She said she was lucky in that she was able to get some experience going on missions and that kind of thing. But, your points about the commanding officers needing to kind of know more how to use FETs was important. But so if you're looking at kind of the difference between the theory and on the ground, we're kind of trying to understand how sort of the theory creates this way of talking about things. And then that has implications for how we understand the work that the FETs were doing, and how, for instance, someone like Sipi Azerbaijani Moghadam or Anna Cole would, because all of those things that you point out about how the military talks in a particular way and has a very kind of strict hierarchical mode of discourse are, I think, things that we're kind of seeing reflected back in the reports that we're looking at.
One of the things that goes right to that directly, and it undermines the basis of everything, and you guys talk about this appropriately so, because that's what the literature says, but Rich and I are trying to get this to change, again, screaming into a hurricane.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
But Rich and I are trying to get this to change, again, screaming into a hurricane. The idea that we have to win hearts and minds in a coin environment is absolutely wrong, because we're coming into an established area. We like talk about rule of law all the time on the news. Rule of law. The rule of law is what it is where you're at, right? The Afghans, Iraqis, all of them could handle murder within the village, and they do it civilly, not penally. So we come in and talk about rule of law. We never take the camera and spin it around and say, what's their rule of law here, right? And so in terms of coin, it's not critical for the Americans to win hearts and minds. That's part of our problem. What's critical is that as we are the insurgents, we are the insurgency. We're trying to remove the Taliban from power and replace it with the new power. So until we can stop becoming the insurgents, the emphasis has to be on that local government winning the hearts and minds. And so all of this conversation, and I'm speaking to the communication side of what you guys do, it's not only the theory is wrong, it's we're going for the wrong thing. And so when we send FETs out, already commanders don't want to. And there's some real ethical problems that we haven't discussed in the paper because papers are limited. But just in general, as we look at the gender role of females in combat, this isn't news to Rich and I, but women have been in combat for a long time. All of my peers who, as you age up in the military, you typically get away from the field. And then they'll say, women don't belong in combat. They can't handle it. I'm like, too late.
Right.
They're out there. I saw a tiny woman, 5'2", something like that. And she's racking around in a 50 cal, which is I'll say a man-sized weapon. This is a big, heavy weapon. And she could put a cigarette in her mouth and be as Rambo as anybody else. I'm using Rambo because you guys use Rambo. And so a lot of these things, like my peers who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s talking about the military, don't have that ground truth reality to understand that the gender role has changed. We had a flamboyantly gay guy who ran the radio for a battalion, and this is an infantry battalion. And then as you came onto the camp, you'd say, Red 6 coming into the camp, and then he would go, fabulous, everything's all clear, and it totally, and you know what that guy could do? That guy could run the radio like nobody's business. He's handling all this traffic, helicopters, vehicles going in and out, all this stuff. He did his job great. He just did it with flair, and nobody cared about that. So a lot of these communication things, and this is why we focus on the ground truth and trying to connect it to strategy or theory, they get broken down because the theoretical language, the way we communicate. Rich and I got uninvited. Our unit said we're doing very special things with PSYOPs, mass communication, and these guys are leading the way in our brigade. Our brigade's 5,000 people, and they're like, no thanks, no thanks. We're doing this in real time.
We got invited, then we got disinvited. Sent out a couple of reports that pissed someone off. Like, don't get these guys. I don't want these guys on my base.
So there's a question in all of this, though, by the way. I wanted to lay some groundwork because this is important. How do we deal with problems like this? I mean, you guys talk about, the gender aspect of what you're looking at, but in general, the entire system refuses to communicate well.
Yeah, well, so certainly as outsiders to the U.S. military, Kelly and I cannot fix the U.S. military's communication problems. But I think, like your points are very well taken. And as Kelly and I were doing this research, we ran into story after story after story of the small little things that women serving as vets would have to do to comply with the official ban on women in combat roles. And so like, whether it was you could only go out one day and then had to come back, you could only spend so long at a forward operating base and that kind of thing. And there was one, I don't remember what year this was, if it was 2014, there was one story of a particular congressman getting upset. And as a result, all of the women who were out at the forward operating bases having to come back so that they weren't caught serving in combat roles and that kind of thing. And so I'm very, it's important, I think, to recognize, especially as you talk about kind of the disjunction between the people who are at the top and the people who are actually, in the field on the ground, recognizing that, the gendering of warfare has changed a lot. And it seems clear that those messages need to be making their way farther upward so that there's a better understanding of what's actually happening on the ground. Kelly?
Well, one thing I would add, and as you were talking about, what you're seeing on the ground versus the theory of what should be happening on the ground, is that what I think rhetorical studies does, the rhetorical perspective does, is to highlight that for all of us, there is no account of what's happening on the ground that is unmediated, that is completely void of any interpretive framework from broader discursive bodies. So Rich, back to your question of like, are you guys guilty of falling into the same trap? Sort of yes and no, I would say, because, what you were doing and as you were writing your piece is looking at the best available evidence that you had in order to interpret and answer the questions that you pose. And that's what any good researcher does. What we're trying to do is say, like, here are these discursive power operations that are at play that have real consequences for what we're even able to see on the ground. You see what I'm saying?
We know what you're saying. We've experienced it.
Yeah.
Hey, there was a congressional delegation that showed up in the area that we worked at, and we were expressly prohibited from showing up, and because they didn't want us talking to that congressional delegation, because that congressional delegation had females. They were interested in the extent to which we're bettering the lives of women in Afghanistan, and they didn't want two dudes going to talk about this,
right.
Because actually we saw some things that ran counter to what was being reported, and also Pete and I served together in 2012. This article took a little while to come out, but we were thinking about some of these problems, and one of the reasons why, I'm not saying I didn't go out with vets. Pete has been out with, we didn't want to because of the ethical problems that we saw doing this,
right.
And that's our approach is first and foremost, like the commander's perspective, because we're in war and nowadays modern combat, gender and sexuality don't really matter. Can you rack that 50 cal handle back and lay down some suppressive fire?
Right.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I can tell you, and I tell this to some of my students who inquire, there are women that I know that I would go to combat with before most of the men that I know.
Yeah.
Because I've been there, and I mean, in fact, I will never forget this one female medic that I went on multiple patrols with. And she was the first person that I would go talk to before the pre-mission briefing. I would go and make sure she knew who I was. I knew who she is. She's the medic, But you know what? She sat overwatch over my position while I'm having meetings. And I didn't think about whether she was male or female,
right?
Or, who she liked to sleep with. That was not my concern. We're in combat.
Yeah. And that's like the materiality of war. Like at the end of the day, you're dealing with the enemy. Your life is on the line. Some of the stuff doesn't matter. What matters is that, whatever Deborah, let's call her, Deborah has your back, and that's all that matters. So that's absolutely the case. And I think though that, that the issue of like what's actually happening on the ground is often divorced from, it's funny, it's both conditioned and sometimes divorced from these broader discourses that we're talking about. So where, I think everybody that you would ask, every individual who was in the military would have a similar story to yours, Rich. But then, where gender and sexuality didn't matter, and what mattered was your knowledge of the person and whether they were going to be able to support you in that role. But then, certain other decisions or actions that you take would be mediated probably by those discursive patterns. And the trick is trying to see, to see your own blind spots, I think.
And so Pete, you mentioned like counterinsurgency as sort of the hearts and minds being somewhat of a limited way of understanding what counterinsurgency is or should do. And so I think the fact that we have tended as a broader society to talk about counterinsurgency as the goal to win hearts and minds, I think sort of conditions then what we look for when we look for, is the counterinsurgency working? Yeah. And for kind of the assumptions that are tied up in how we're talking about these things are, I think, what Kelly and I are interested in exploring, and how then they influence the way that the FETs were written about.
You didn't even need to talk to anyone in FETs to do your work, because your work is using the FET as an example to talk about how these discursive frameworks eventually structure.
Look at Rich. He's a new vocabulary. Hey, I think you ladies will appreciate this, because it goes to what you're talking about. So in modern conflict, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because they don't know. In modern conflict, there are, I would call them co-belligerents. We're all competing for something. It's not a flag. It's not a piece of land. So you have to take a different approach. And I would say it's a feminine approach, because it has to be led by affect over effect. Us dudes, we're like, she's going to love me. I'm going to write 15 love letters, and that bitch is going to love me. That's how we do it. Meanwhile, here's another one. Quantitative data in a non-permissive area is completely unreliable. Right. It's all about qualitative data, which again, to me, is a much more feminine thing. Like, I had this conversation with this person. I looked them in the eye, and we had this connection, and then we did.
I read their body language.
Right. Yeah. All of these things.
The various kinds of stuff that gets dismissed in these reports, right?
Right.
And that stuff is unreliable.
Even us writing academically, we had to learn how to speak to that qualitative data. And I'll tell you, we have direct evidence of, we went into this district, which is almost completely non-permissive. And we came back with X number of respondents, and their number of respondents was greater than the known population of that district.
Yeah, I got reprimanded for not using data. And they're like, well, why aren't you using this? It's like your own collection protocol.
Yeah.
And this is actually a chapter in a book that that's in press right now in an edited volume. No, that's not the same paper. It's a paper under review. By the survey organization's own collection protocol, there weren't even that many people that lived in the geographic area. Their sample size was larger, and they claimed to sample approximately equal number males and females. Having that data would have been awesome if it wasn't just falsified to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I got in trouble. Why aren't you using this data? It's like, because it's bullshit. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it.
One of the things that Kelly and I kind of want to call attention to in the last section of our essay is sort of the assumption that any useful, worthwhile data is quantitative and not qualitative and not based. Because I think you're right, Pete, that like you look people in the eye and you can learn a whole bunch of stuff. And the other thing that, as we were talking about situating the FETs in the broader conversation about counterinsurgency and not just female engagement, we certainly, as we were doing our research, found a lot of confirmation of what you just said, Rich, that data gathering procedures, even when male soldiers were out on patrol and that kind of thing, were wildly unreliable and that kind of thing because of the limitations of the operating environment and that kind of thing. So again, like a broader challenge in trying to get that type of data in an unstable operating environment. But that's something that like both men and women have to contend with. Whereas the reports that we're looking at kind of say that like this is one unique failing of the FETs instead of a challenge of counterinsurgency broadly.
Right. And that's, in our conclusion when we talk about, a possible alternative, like, one thing we tried to do was imagine a way that these women could have written their reports and avoided the trap that they fell into, which is, sort of promoting this latent sexism that I don't think they intend to do, but they nonetheless are guilty of. And that it would be just that, contextualize these criticisms within a broader criticism of counterinsurgency. Recognize that male troops are failing in to provide reliable empirical data of their own success, just like women are.
So don't criticize FET for being FET. Criticize how FET was applied in the framework of counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
Can I say that?
And criticize counterinsurgency.
Ooh, well, we've been doing that for quite a while. So we're already on that.
But yeah, I mean, the problem is not that these are, or at least in our minds, the problem we're pointing to is not that, FETs were being really ineffective and were naive and undertrained. All of those things were likely true. But like the problem we want to call attention to is not understanding the unique challenges the FETs were facing in kind of a broader framework of counterinsurgency. And as we were doing our research, we found all sorts of things confirming what you just mentioned, Rich, that there were tons of folks concerned that male soldiers didn't have the local intelligence necessary to engage in the work that counterinsurgency demanded, like building relationships and understanding the unique geopolitics of the region.
It wasn't just that these women were plagued by a certain feminine propensity to over-imagine their own success, or to be dogged in their determination to prove their success. That they were flawed in the same ways that their male counterparts were flawed.
Yeah, this is true. This is absolutely true. Everybody you talk to won the war when they were there. And here's the thing. When you stay and you see a picture of when they won the war and you go back outside, like literally there was a place called Route Chicken. We name routes so we can remember them. And the PRT had reopened Route Chicken. And then the Taliban said no and took it back. And so 2 units later, they're like, our goal was to reopen Route Chicken. You're like, there's the picture on the wall. And this is what I would do all the time as a communicator, right? So the unit would come in and say, we're going to use radio in a box, the REAB. And this is one of those non-gender specific MOSs. Anybody can do this. And so whether I'm talking to a male or female, it didn't matter. And they would say, okay, here's the plan. We're going to put these radios out. We're going to spread radios out into the region, and we're going to communicate through the radio. God bless. Great, in theory. Here are the slide decks from the last 4 units with the exact same program. Now, what are we going to do? And again, Rich and I had to learn this the hard way because we're dudes. But everything the military does is this upward arrow with these events that go up the arrow and
always
inexorably
moving forward.
Yeah, it always leads to the. But when you realize that the environment is a cloud to you, an arrow can't hit a cloud, and so you have to slow down and go, what do we even know anymore, right? And something like FET becomes really a problem, or ag teams, or even civil affairs.
Yep.
It all becomes a problem. Right, because there are many confounding factors that you can't even account for.
You gotta win. You gotta win.
Yeah.
When you put in a report, you can't say we're losing. Nobody wants to hear that.
Yeah. Well, that's a problem.
Please let me evaluate my own tenure packet. Please.
Right. Yeah. We found a lot of slide decks online as we were researching FETs that had these sort of opaque diagrams of all of the things that were going in to understand the operating environment, and the number of them that were similar, or the number of briefings that we found given by the same experts, kind of indicated to us that there was sort of a recreation of the wheel every time that FETs were being sent out. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if, I guess you can call them a FET, but I don't know. I did a lot of work with the Romanian army, and there were women who were doctors, and to take them out on patrol, like there's some things like I cannot do. Like I can't necessarily get into that village cluster. Well, first, if I'm not invited, but then there's areas within that village cluster I can't go. But if I've got a female engagement team and medical personnel, they're able to, do some good, right? And spread goodwill, but then again, at the same time, like, and Pete's chomping at the bit right there. He wants to jump in. It's like, well, we're not supposed to be doing that. right? The local government needs to be doing that. Let the local government figure out a way to get these, we can help by all means. That's why Pete and I like to say boots on the ground state building, to go back to my political science knowledge. If we're going to build the institutions of the state, we can help, but we need to be funneling that help through the existing power structure. Yeah, right. And we may not like that power structure is gendered, but hey, there's a guy named Zarif out there, and he's got daughters, and he doesn't want his daughters to have a bad life, but he understands that he's bound by a cultural code to first make sure that he has an older son who carries on the family name and continues that local culture and custom,
Pete, are you chomping at the bit there?
Oh, no, I was leaving room for you ladies to respond. There's always something for me to complain about. Okay, if you want to ask me to say something, I would just add that in terms of ethics, right, and this is not an academic term, this is a Pete term because we've not written the paper yet, but there reaches a point of ethical saturation for any commander. And a commander in a combat zone has 4 basic things they have to do. They have to close with and destroy the enemy. They have to protect the force. They have to enable the enablers, and then teach and train the local government official, people, police, whatever it's going to be. That's already a lot on their plate in a place that's non-permissive. And so when we add things like a female engagement team in, or you worry about male on male child rape. These are things that you just quickly are overcome. And so if we add gender into this thing, I'm afraid that it just gets whipped up into this, this twisted ethical thing where right becomes wrong and wrong becomes right, and doing nothing to prevent an anal rape of a boy is the right answer, because tomorrow when you walk through that valley, you want to still be alive, right? So how do we deal with these things as we try to evolve and be better at all of these things? What do we do to create some ethical bandwidth, some reliable outcomes? Because Rich and I are talking about all of these problems that are systematic, and we struggle to communicate internally. By the way, I'm going to add another confounding factor in. There is no professional level training at working with an interpreter. And yet nearly every operators of SEALs, Special Forces, guys like me, we will all tell you that we've had more conversations in combat zones than we've shot bullets.
Yeah.
And yet we don't even focus on talking, and we don't focus on how to work an interpreter. So how do we deal with these things as academics? We can't just continue to pile things on and say more training. There is no bandwidth for more training.
That's a tough question. That is, certainly, decently outside Kelly and my expertise. I mean, I think I don't want to speak for Kelly, but certainly I think we agree with you that, that we need to find a way to do this better and to make sure that the important elements of the operating environment are being understood and taken into consideration by
complicated, and that what we consider just in the United States is not necessarily what another population considers just, and it's not necessarily ethical for us to impose that view on another group of people. So we agree with you there. But gosh, some of the ethical problems you're talking about, they're really, really sticky.
Yeah. And to be fair, whenever we write papers, our reviews typically come back with these things are wrong. They come back with, will tell us what to do. And we're like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We're pointing out how that it's impossible,
Well, one of our suggestions and something we're working on now is we really need to take, and you guys touch on this a little bit, we really need to reconceptualize this, this mindset of the warrior scholar, because you have to simultaneously be the cartoon Rambo, but you have to still be smart on the ground. And it's not just about following orders or not, it's understanding the context in which you're executing that mission, So it's one thing to learn about a weapon system's capabilities. It's another thing to deploy that weapon system, and then to go and measure whether or not you've deployed that system effectively. If you've got the wrong assumptions that go into before you even started working with that weapon system, well, then the outcome's going to be, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly, as people who study communication, understanding communication is, if not half, but like a big chunk of what we do is try to understand the context out of which communication comes, and the understanding then that the audience for that communication would bring to a particular message. So understanding the context and understanding what you're trying to achieve in that place, I think is, a starting point, to be sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And part of the other thing that I like to say, I'm when I was a younger person, I was trained as an infantryman, and then I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
And I've made the argument in the field. I've been making the argument since in some of the symposium settings that we've been involved in, conferences. It's a lot easier, I think, to take a soldier and turn him into a scholar than it is to take a scholar and put him in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys mentioned the human terrain system in your paper. Have a little bit of experience with them, but they just kind of took the wrong approach. It's nice to have an anthropologist in the field, but if that anthropologist first doesn't understand, you're going to have to shoot, move, and communicate. And having worked with an anthropologist in the field who was more interested in writing 30-page research products. Commander doesn't care about that, by the way.
Right.
You give that commander 2 to 3 pages that he can read while he's on his way to another meeting, it's going to have more of an impact.
Sure.
And I'm back in garrison right now. I can write my 30-page research paper.
Yeah.
But this commander needs something actionable. And he doesn't have time. He or she does not have time to necessarily do the background homework it takes to understand, some of the work that I saw some people try to produce while we were there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Certainly, the pressures under which the different groups are operating under are radically different.
Yeah.
And one of the critiques that Azerbaijani Moghadam makes of the FETS reporting is that it was simply too long. And your point about the contextual pressures that commanding officers are under is well taken in that regard.
Yeah, especially since we were giving commanders reports in the format they wanted, which wasn't 30 pages.
Right.
I wanted to bring up another point based on gender too, because a lot of this stuff relies on perspective. And this is one of the lessons that, look, I got this wrong. And I'm not saying this, I know you guys get this, but for everybody else in the whole wide world, I got this wrong more than I ever got this right until I finally saw the lesson. But we tend to put our own lens on things. And that's why I talk in terms of lenses, like, it's like going to the optometrist, and they're fixing your eyes.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And we forget to, like we talk about the 1%, I'm always reminding people, scope the camera back, and you're like, shit, I poop into potable water. Yep. I'm as indulgent as anybody in the world. You take the angle from the Afghan point of view, and all of a sudden you realize, God, we are so wrong on all of this. And then if you take the gender side of things and you look at it from a male point of view, and a male commander, because we talked and had a guy come up and he came out of left field and smacked us in the face with a 2x4. And he's like, look, and this guy's African from Africa, but now in the U.S. service. And he's like, as a commander, and he's a transportation commander, his job is to move things from place A to place B. Anybody can do that job. I cannot take on the risk of the hypersexualized hyper target of a female isolated in my patrol. Because yes, grabbing a U.S. service member, but if she's got big tits, even better. I mean, that's exactly what, because they'll rape her repeatedly. So as a commander, you're like, there's no way in hell I'm going to put any of my service members through that, especially a woman. And there was literally a woman who was captured and raped repeatedly for, I don't know, well over a month on the American main camp in Iraq. And it's a giant camp, multi-cluster camp, but no one even knew she was gone. And so when a commander hears that and they have enough problems to deal with, again, this goes back to like, how do we fit in, gender normative behavior and all these other things? It almost becomes a joke to a commander who's like, I have to close with the enemy, and I only have time to do these things, and I can't get all of them done. These other things are going to have to wait.
I remember that commander saying that at the conference, and he shut a lot of people up when he said that.
Yeah.
Other people in uniform, because he's like, look, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Because now we're already involved in an international incident. That's going to make the news, and he's straight up, like, and Pete and I have heard these stories before, but it wasn't until he's like, hey, look at it from my perspective, you know? So that guy really, the idea of looking at things for like the ethical problem that commanders have to deal with, boy, that didn't just resonate with him. It shot through the room.
Yeah, and I certainly I don't think Kelly or I have any intention or desire to be insensitive to the very real pressures that people operating in, as you say, non-permissive terrains are under, and understanding the context in which gender and power operate both in Afghanistan and the unique pressures that it puts on the U.S. military as well, I think are really important bodies of contextual knowledge to be able to draw on.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all in agreement that if you're going to do it right.
Right.
And we're never going to get it perfect, but, we certainly could have done a much better job. And we could have not only prepared vets better, we could have prepared ourselves better to not just work with vets, but to work in that environment. And that I think that goes back to, let's critique this from the broader umbrella of what is counterinsurgency and how is it supposed to be done.
You guys encountered some of this discussion of these ethical questions and the sort of ambiguity of ethics have been reminding me of a book Jenny and I read as grad students called The Politics of Piety by Sarah Mahmood. She's an anthropologist, and in her introduction, she does a really great job of kind of putting up a microscope to our Western ethics system. And, she basically charges American policymakers with committing a form of ethical imperialism in other countries, our ethical system is the best, it's universal and you should embrace it too. And she talks about, that's a mistake. So that might help you in some of the work you're doing. It's The Politics of Piety.
Just wrote that down. I think I might have heard of it, but I'm not sure.
We have a book recommendation for you as well.
Oh, good. Let get my pen in.
We referenced a lady named Benedicta Grima, and she did.
I was trying to find the book. I couldn't find it.
It's super hard to find, and it's so wonderful because it illustrates, in general, what we don't know. We have no idea about the gender things, and because I'd read the book ahead of time, I understood that for a lot of Afghan women, raising a family safely and well is as noble as you can be, and far be it from me to even try to sort out left from right, who wants to be an astronaut. It's just, it was too complex for me to even focus on because I was trying to keep people alive day to day. But that book is fantastic. I'll send you my copy of it. It's a great book. And
what's the title?
I think it's called Notes from the Field.
Secrets from the Field. An ethnographer's notes from northwestern Pakistan. She lived amongst Pashtun people. So she's able to very clearly start to peel back some of these layers, and the idea that you have to be and you have to do Pashto, and if you're not Pashto, it's more than just learning the language, there's so many unwritten rules. There's so many informal requirements that are placed on women that we just don't understand, and for crying out loud, didn't women in Saudi Arabia just recently get the right to drive? And I mean, let's not pretend that we're doing the best we can do here in our own country. The political scientist in me now is raging, look at ourselves. This is Pete's point of just turn it around and look at us. Let's analyze ourselves and our own culture, and then let's go and figure out how to engage in these operations that are supposed to be improving people's lives.
Yeah, totally. When you were telling the story about that commander, and I'm sure he was genuine in his desire to protect his women soldiers, but I had this impulse to just add, when the military can sort out its own problem with raping women women, then I'll be a little more hospitable to that.
Yeah.
I'll be a little more trusting of that perspective.
Not going to push back. I mean, the views I've expressed here are not the views of my university. They're the views of myself.
And to that commander's point, he's likely got pressure. Put women in the driver's seat. Put them on the edge of your formation. You have to do this. And he's like, but I can't protect them.
Right. And that's that. I mean, that is an admirable admission.
And he means this as a service member. He doesn't mean this as a weakling female. Like
absolutely.
It's like I've got a person in my patrol who's got compromised lungs. I have to deal with that. She is a hyper target.
Right.
But you're right. Let's clean up our own stuff in house.
Yeah. Well, at least that we would be perhaps a little bit more trusting of that perspective. If our own sexism was not a problem. So.
Well, what it might also do, and I don't want to step in your lane here, but maybe I will, it might actually help us improve our communication, our approach to communication. Am I supposed to discursive something? Yeah. It might help us talk to one another a little bit more clearly.
Yeah.
About what we're actually doing, what we're supposed to be doing, and then how we then measure the effectiveness of what we're doing.
Right. And there's a difference in saying, I think to your troop, we have to protect Susan because Susan is at risk in this particular context, rather than we have to protect Susan because she's a woman and her innate, she's at risk innately because of her biology. No, she's at risk because of this discursive context where women have been gendered in this particular way, but it's not essential to her identity. It's essential to this context. That's a different explanation.
I wanted to provide some context in some of this stuff because of the military is a male-dominated place because it's primarily men. And I was on a patrol with a bunch of artillerymen, and they spend a lot of time out in the field, and there might be a female out there, but for the most part, it's all dudes, and no one takes showers and all that stuff. Matter of fact, you don't take a shower so long that when you take a shower, you're like, oh, everybody smells. But you get used to it. Yeah. So there was a beautiful, very attractive, very curvaceous commander's driver who would drive the commander wherever. And I think he kept her close because, well, one, she's pleasant to look at, but two, to protect her in parts because you can't mess with her. Like whatever she needs to do, so she was so attractive, even in uniform, that she got out of the car one time and it's hot. She takes her helmet off and she throws her hair around, rebuns it. Every dude, including me, every dude within 100 feet of that was just looking at her like hungry because biologically that makes us hungry. Right. And some of this stuff, or we're at out in Mazan, Rich, I don't know if you ever heard it, but the helicopter would fly in the evening to bring us someone or mail or whatever it was. And a bunch of dudes would come into the operations center because they wanted to hear the female helicopter pilot's voice if she was flying in that night. They didn't know for sure if she was or not, but they just wanted to hear that.
Voice. Yeah.
Reptile brain.
Yeah.
I read a lot of diaries of French prisoners of war who'd never heard a woman's voice for 5 years. And, they talked a lot about that. They fantasized about, they would like look at on the outskirts of their camps at German women's undergarments hanging on a line and just fantasize, So, I think though what I'm, I don't mean to deny that there's anything biological about, human sexuality and attraction. That's absolutely the case. But when you're at work, and you're explaining a work decision, probably best not to use essential sexism to do it, but to recognize that
don't let the smell of shampoo throw you off.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to push you guys on, because I know you can take it and everything, is there's been warrior scholars for a long time. It's just our scholarship is very specific and appropriately so. It takes a lot. Like Rich had to teach me a lot about political science. I had to teach myself a lot about, anthropology and everything. And you just can't, it's like about a liberal arts degree. It's like a liberal arts degree cubed, and you just have to know about so many things. There are some wonderful scholars, and this is probably more for the audience than you ladies, but when you go into a brigade staff room, there are several PhDs. Everybody in that room has at least one degree, probably two, and oftentimes three. If you're a commander, you've got 2 master's degrees at a given. And I'm talking like a senior commander. So the scholarship is there. It's just, how do we continue to tune what that scholarship needs to be? And we never pick a staff based upon a pedigree of education. We're like, hey, we don't have anybody that focuses on anthropology, or we don't have anybody that focuses on rhetoric. We need to have these things out. Because one of the things I would do, again, putting my communication hat on, is when I first got to a unit, I would look at how they communicated in their slides. And I would know instantly where the holes were because I had seen all the mistakes. And again, I'd made them all. So that scholarship piece, it's there. It needs some, I don't know, I guess I would say it just needs some variety, and then maybe some design in applying variety into around that round table of people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sort of the first section of our paper identifies is both Sipi Azerbaijani Mogadem and Anna Cole pointing to, the need for more of this to get into a place where people can use it and access it. And I think too, the shift to focusing on counterinsurgency and its demand for real local knowledge and understanding of the geopolitics that exist in these very, very different cultures than our own, really kind of emphasizes and brings to the fore the need for sort of a scholarly perspective on what's happening.
But, and that scholarly perspective is hard to get due to the sort of neoliberal university. I mean, I'm amazed that you guys were able to access the article, because it's behind this firewall of
your article.
Expensive.
I had to get it through interlibrary loan.
Yeah, right. I mean, and so you have that privilege because you have a university affiliation, but for civilians, as we call them,
something different
for academics means something different for us. Exactly. They're never going to read that. They're never going to read that piece. So yeah, I think that both the academy and probably the military could do more to make to be more transparent and to make their stuff more accessible.
Well, you could teach people how to learn. That's one thing that we're arguing. You can, that's my point of don't bother with teaching a PhD how to be a soldier. Teach a soldier how to think. Yeah. And you don't even have to have a PhD level of understanding.
No.
You can acquire that. You could teach a person how to learn.
Yeah, agreed. Speaking of teaching, I've got to run.
Yes.
Duty calls.
Yeah, duty calls. I hate to. You guys feel free to continue the conversation if you want.
No, but thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. I feel smarter.
And if you guys ever want to partner up on a paper, we'd love to do it. Because there's a lot to do still.
Again, Kelly and I are not experts in military operations, but this was very illuminating for us and a useful reminder of all of the million things that are happening when you're actually in the battle environment. So this was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for finding our paper and reaching out to us.
No problem. Thank you all so much. All right, I'm going to sign us all off here.
All right.
Thank you.